My name is Maya, and for a long time I believed that love and ambition were two parallel lines that could run together forever without ever needing to cross or collide. I met Julian in our final year of university. He was steady, poetic, and possessed a quiet confidence that acted as an anchor to my high-strung energy. While I was pulling all-nighters to secure a junior partnership track at a top-tier architectural firm, Julian was content building a boutique furniture brand. He was the person who reminded me to eat, who celebrated my smallest wins, and who promised that my career would never be a problem for us. In the beginning, it wasn't. We were a team. When I got my first major promotion, we celebrated with cheap champagne in our tiny apartment, surrounded by blueprints and sawdust. But as my projects grew from residential renovations to multi-million-dollar civic centers, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. The first cracks didn't appear as arguments. They appeared as silences. The dinner rule. We had an agreement to be home by 7 p.m., but 7 p.m. became 8:30, then 10. The comparison. Julian's business was steady, but mine was explosive. He began making small, joking comments about being the plus one at my industry galas. The burden of success. I found myself apologizing for my success. I would hide my excitement about a new contract to avoid making him feel stagnant. By our fourth year of marriage, I was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Lead architect for a sustainable city-within-a-city project in Singapore. It required relocation for 2 years. What about my shop? Julian asked, his voice flat. What about the life we built here? I suggested he could expand, that Singapore was a hub for luxury design. But for the first time, I saw resentment in his eyes. To save the marriage, I did the unthinkable. I turned it down. I chose us over me. I thought that sacrifice would be the foundation of a new, stronger chapter. Instead, it became the tombstone. Because I had compromised my soul, I began to resent his presence. Every time I looked at him, I didn't see my husband. I saw the reason I wasn't in Singapore. And Julian, feeling my withdrawal, became increasingly possessive and insecure. The turning point. A relationship cannot survive when one person has to shrink for the other to feel big enough. The relationship drama escalated into something more toxic. Julian began checking my call logs, questioning why I was working late with male colleagues and showing up at my office unannounced. He framed it as caring, but it felt like surveillance. One night after a high-stakes board meeting, I came home to find he had packed a suitcase, not for himself, but for me. You're never here anyway, Maya, he said, his voice trembling. Your career is your husband. I'm just the landlord. That night, the argument wasn't about work. It was about years of unspoken grievances. He accused me of being cold. I accused him of being a shackle. We were two people who loved each other, but we no longer liked the people we had become in each other's company. The decision. The divorce wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, painful dismantling. We tried counseling, but you can't fix a relationship where the core values have diverged. I wanted to build skyscrapers. He wanted a quiet porch. Both were valid, but they couldn't exist in the same house. The day I signed the papers, I felt a strange mixture of grief and oxygen. For the first time in years, I could breathe without checking if I was taking up too much space. The year following the divorce was the hardest of my life. I was the divorcee at work and the career woman who couldn't keep a man in my social circles. My productivity dipped. I felt like a failure in both worlds. But resilience isn't about not falling. It's about how you design the foundation after the collapse. I took a sabbatical. I traveled, not for work, but for my own eyes. I rediscovered why I loved architecture. It wasn't about the status. It was about the way a space can hold a human being's hope. I eventually returned to the firm, but with a different boundary. I was no longer running away from a broken home into my work. I was running toward my purpose. 3 years later, I stood on the balcony of a building I designed. It wasn't in Singapore, but it was mine. I ran into Julian at a gallery opening. He looked happy, happier than he ever was with me. He had married a woman who worked in his shop, someone who shared his pace. We spoke for 10 minutes. There was no vitriol, only a quiet acknowledgement of the storm we had survived. You built it, he said, gesturing to the skyline. I did, I replied, and I didn't have to ask for permission. The takeaway. My story isn't a tragedy because it ended in divorce. It's a success because it ended in truth. I learned that. 1. Ambition is not a flaw. It is a trait that requires a partner who views your light as a beacon, not a glare. 2. Compromise has a limit. If you compromise your core identity, you eventually have nothing left to give the relationship. 3. Self-discovery is a solo journey. Sometimes you have to lose the we to find the I. The divorce wasn't just a legal separation. It was an architectural audit of my soul. We sat in a sterile room with fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and gray. Julian's lawyer, a man who treated emotions like mathematical errors, began the character deconstruction. In a no-fault world, the drama isn't about who cheated, it's about worth. Julian was suing for a significant portion of my future earnings and the equity in our home, arguing that his support and the sacrifices he made for my career were the only reasons I had reached my current level of success. The testimony of time. They produced a calendar. Every late night, every business trip to Dubai or London, every weekend spent at the firm was highlighted in red. Does a partner who is never present truly contribute to a marriage? His lawyer asked. The distortion of care. Julian sat there looking defeated, playing the part of the abandoned husband. He testified that he felt like a domestic employee rather than a spouse. It was a calculated move to weaponize the very thing I was proud of, my work ethic, and turn it into a sign of neglect. The breaking point. My lawyer tried to pivot, pointing out the Singapore sacrifice. But Julian's side argued that I had made that choice out of guilt, not love, further proving the toxic nature of my ambition. Sitting in that witness stand, I realized the court doesn't care about the midnight conversations where I supported his business or the way I dimmed my light so he wouldn't feel overshadowed. They only care about the paper trail. Watching him nod as his lawyer called me cold and calculated was the moment I realized the man I loved was truly gone. He was replaced by a stranger who wanted to be compensated for the burden of my dreams. The all is lost moment didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened 6 months later in the middle of a construction site for what was supposed to be my comeback project, the Alara Tower. I was physically and emotionally exhausted from the divorce proceedings, which had drained my savings. I was living in a sparsely furnished rental, and the oxygen I felt after the divorce had turned into a suffocating vacuum of loneliness. Then the floor fell out. 1. The engineering oversight. A massive structural flaw was discovered in the foundation of the Alara Tower. It wasn't my direct fault. An external contractor had used substandard materials, but as a lead architect, the buck stopped with me. 2. The professional pariah. Because of the high-profile nature of my divorce, the tabloids and industry blogs picked up the story. They didn't just talk about the building, they talked about me. Is Maya's personal life affecting her professional judgment? 3. The financial ruin. The firm put me on administrative leave. My insurance was tied up in the litigation. I was staring at the possibility of losing my license, my reputation, and the very career I had sacrificed my marriage to protect. The night in the rain. I remember standing on the edge of the Alara site at 2 a.m., the rain soaking through my expensive wool coat. I looked at the skeletal steel beams of the unfinished building, a giant, rusted monument to my failure. I had no husband. I had no home. And now I had no work. I sat on a concrete block and cried, not the quiet, dignified tears of a protagonist, but the ugly, shaking sobs of someone who had gambled everything on a single dream and lost the bet. I felt like I had built my entire identity on sand. If I wasn't an architect and I wasn't a wife, who was I? The realization. When you lose everything you thought defined you, you are forced to meet the person who remains. I realized that night that I was still Maya. Even without the titles, even without the partner, the mind that designed those buildings was still inside me. Recovery didn't happen with a montage. It happened in the boring moments. The legal battle, spending hours in libraries researching building codes to prove the contractor's negligence. The humility, taking a job as a freelance consultant for a small firm, doing residential kitchen layouts just to pay the rent. The silence, learning to sit in a quiet apartment without a TV or a phone, just being okay with my own company. I eventually cleared my name regarding the Alara Tower. The contractor was held liable, and while the project was scrapped, my reputation was slowly mended. But I didn't go back to the shark I was before. I was different now, hardened, yes, but also more intentional. Re-entering the dating world felt like trying to learn a new language after a stroke. I was 36, divorced with baggage, and my professional life was still a construction site under renovation. The first few dates were disasters of the highest order. I had spent a decade in a partnership where we spoke in a shorthand of shared history. Now I had to explain my entire existence over lukewarm appetizers to men who were either intimidated by my ambition or, worse, saw it as a challenge to domesticate me. The interviewer. One man spent 40 minutes asking about my billable hours, looking at me like I was a stock he wanted to invest in, rather than a woman he wanted to know. The fixer. Another spent the whole night giving me unsolicited advice on how to soften my image to avoid scaring off men. I paid for my drink and left before the main course. I realized I was dating with a shield up. I was looking for signs of Julian in every man I met. If they were too quiet, I assumed they were stewing in resentment. If they were too supportive, I assumed they were lying. The insight. I wasn't looking for a partner. I was looking for a preemptive strike. I was trying to find the ending before I even started the book. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Julian at a professional mixer. I was there to network for my new boutique firm. He was there because he was designing the furniture for the lobby. The air between us didn't crackle with romance. It felt like a cold front. "You look busy," he said, holding a glass of sparkling water. It was a loaded word. In our marriage, busy was his favorite weapon. "I'm productive, Julian. There's a difference," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I saw the news about the Alara Tower. I almost called," he admitted. But he didn't look sorry. He looked vindicated. "I thought maybe now she'll realize that the career won't love her back when things go wrong." "That's where you're wrong," I said, stepping closer. "The career didn't sue me for half my life's work. The career didn't call me cold in a courtroom. The career just required a better foundation. I'm rebuilding mine. Are you still building yours on the backs of people you want to keep small?" He didn't have an answer. For the first time, the quiet confidence I once loved looked like what it actually was, a lack of depth. I met Liam at a literal construction site. He was the lead site foreman, dusty boots, grease on his hands, and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by my title. Our first date wasn't at a 5-star restaurant. It was sitting on a toolbox, eating sandwiches and arguing over the load-bearing capacity of a new glass polymer. The difference. When I told Liam I had to cancel a weekend trip for a deadline, he didn't pout. He sent me a delivery of high-quality coffee and a note that said, "Go kill it. The mountains aren't going anywhere." The vulnerability. One night I broke down. I told him about the courtroom, about the all-is-lost night in the rain, and my fear that I was fundamentally unpartnerable. The response. He didn't try to fix me. He just said, "Maya, a skyscraper needs a deep foundation because of how high it goes. You aren't difficult. You're just built for a higher altitude." Not everyone can handle the wind up there. The final confrontation happened when Julian reached out a year later. He wanted me to sign off on some lingering paperwork regarding the sale of our old house. He asked to meet at a cafe we used to frequent. He looked older. The bitterness had etched lines around his mouth. He spent the first 20 minutes complaining about his new partner, how she didn't understand his creative process. Julian, I interrupted. Stop. What? You didn't bring me here for the papers. You brought me here to see if I was still miserable, to see if I'd finally admitted you were right, that I'm too much for anyone to love. He stiffened. I'm not miserable, I continued, sliding the signed papers across the table. I'm happy. And the irony is, I'm more successful now than I was when we were together. Because I stopped spending 50% of my energy trying to make you feel like the sun. I stood up. I loved you, Julian. But I love the woman I became after I lost you even more. Please don't call me again unless it's about a tax form. I walked out of that cafe and didn't look back. The drama was over. The architecture of my new life was finally complete. Not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. 5 years is a lifetime in the world of architecture, and an eternity in the geography of the heart. I am 41 now. I live in a house I designed myself, a structure of glass, cedar, and light tucked into a hillside. It doesn't apologize for its presence, and neither do I. The career building legacies. The Maya Brown name, a name I reclaimed with a fierce sense of pride, is no longer associated with the Alara Tower collapse. Instead, it's synonymous with the Horizon Project, a series of low-income, sustainable housing units that won the Pritzker Prize last year. I learned that success isn't about the height of the building, but the strength of the community it holds. I no longer work 100-hour weeks out of fear. I work them out of passion, and I've learned the art of the hard no. I don't take projects that require me to sacrifice my humanity, and I don't work with people who mistake kindness for weakness. The relationship, a new blueprint. Liam and I never married in the traditional sense. After the wreckage of my first marriage, the idea of a legal contract felt like a cage. Instead, we have a partnership of equals. We spend our Friday nights not in arguments over missed dinners, but in the studio, a shared space in our home where he restores vintage motorcycles and I sketch. We exist in a state of parallel play, two independent orbits that choose to stay in the same galaxy. The most profound moment of my new life happened a few months ago. I was late coming home from a site visit in a different city. My flight was delayed, I was exhausted, and I felt that old familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest, the Julian knot. I expected to walk through the door to a lecture, a cold shoulder, or a list of grievances about my priorities. Instead, I walked in to find the lights dimmed, a plate of food kept warm, and Liam asleep on the sofa with a book on his chest. When he woke up, he didn't check his watch. He just smiled and said, "Rough day at the office? Tell me about the cantilevers. I bet they looked incredible." I realized then that I hadn't just built a career. I had finally built a life that had room for me. The final reflection. If I could go back to that woman sitting in the rain at the Alara site, I wouldn't tell her it gets easier. I would tell her it gets truer. The divorce wasn't the end of my story. It was the demolition required to build something earthquake-proof. Resilience isn't a gift you're born with. It's the debris you pick up and repurpose. I am Maya. I am an architect. I am a partner. And for the first time in my life, I am not sorry for any of it.